Hello, everyone. Welcome to this fifth day of the 2022 Virtual Island Summit. Thank you all so much for joining this session. My name is Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. I am the Community Manager and the Ambassador Program Coordinator here at Island Innovation. So welcome all of you. Island Innovation, as some of us already know, is a global network and creative agency which helps to advance innovation and drive sustainable development and change across island communities worldwide. So please visit our website, which is islandinnovation.co, and there you can learn more about our network and all our services that we offer. Now, I'm very happy to be presenting this session today, which is entitled Building Climate Resilience Through Food Security. This is really near and dear to my heart as someone who lives in an island territory like Barbados, where we import so much of our food. It's really crucial that we try as much as we can to build the agricultural sector, which in turn is affected by any extreme weather events, and then that has a negative effect on our food security. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to use the chat function to introduce yourself. Please let me know where in the world some of you are joining us from. You can make any comments about the session in the chat function, in the chat box, but you can also use the Q&A function. Okay, so a poll is going to appear, or perhaps it already has appeared. That's going to ask you a little bit about where you're joining from and the sector and industry that you belong to. Okay, so you can answer that poll and I'll take a look at the results. Okay, I see some comments coming in from the chat. We have people from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Toronto, Canada, Trinidad, Wales in the UK. It's great to see everyone. Also people from St. Lucia. It's fantastic. Okay, Mauritius coming in. Yes, we have another person from beautiful Barbados. That's fantastic. I see a strong Barbados contingent coming through, and then we have the Bahamas as well. Hello. And Algeria, we have participants from as far as Algeria. That's great. Okay, so the poll, most of you should have seen the poll already and should be making a move to answer the questions. Okay, great. So we can see here that many of you actually are from Europe and North America. So that's the region that most of you are joining from today. And then from the Caribbean, however, is the strongest contingent here. So we have 35% of our participants are joining from the Caribbean. And then that's closely followed by Europe and North America. And then also the vast majority of people are from the private sector. Okay, and many, many people as well. There's a very close tie between the environmental services as well as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So thanks so much to everyone for taking the poll. Now we have a good idea of how we're being represented here today. So without further ado, I am going to be your moderator, just letting you know. And we have a really esteemed and insightful panel today. I'd like to introduce the members of our panel. We're going to have Jerry Spooner, who's representing the Vanuatu Department of Tourism. He's going to do a pre-recorded address for us. Then we'll move on to Ben Tustin. He's the founder of the Seaweed Food Company. After Ben's speech and Ben's presentation, we'll have Elise Rostand, who is the program manager of the Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design right here in Barbados. We look forward to that. And we'll also have Miguel Labranche, the COO of Miditech. Okay, so without further ado, we will now begin with the pre-recorded message from Jerry Spooner of the Vanuatu Department of Tourism.
Greetings from Vanuatu. My name is Jerry Spooner, and I'm a founder of Regenerative Vanua. And before I move on, just to add some explanation around the word used, Vanua. Vanua in Vanuatu means community, land, home. Everyone within it is embraced. So, and we've used that in the naming of the non-for-profit organization, and we see it very fit for using it. And for Vanuatu, as we all know, is one of the countries in the world that's mostly vulnerable to climate change. hence sustainable is no longer enough to deal with impacts of climate change due to what we are currently seeing and experiencing. We believe sustainable is no longer relevant. So the key challenges for Vanuatu, and I know this segment talks about food security, but our key challenge in Vanuatu, when talking about food, is not food security, it's the nutrition security. And that said, it's more so the nutrition because we don't have the lack of food access in Vanuatu. We are choosing more the wrong food than having access to food, and that's due to our dependency on imported food, and that definitely lowers our resilience. And if looking at it closely, the main cause of this problem is having the lack of pride in our food culture, local food culture. So I'd like to quickly talk about the approach Vanuatu has undertaken in 2020, and that is to change how government was approaching agritourism in the past, and that is focusing on increasing the supply of local food within the tourism industry. But now the focus is more on developing agritourism experiences that are aimed at reviving pride in our local food, because without locals having pride in their local food, then that will be reflected in how the experiences for local, tourists coming from abroad would be reflected upon it. So agritourism, regenerative agritourism at its core is about respecting our indigenous knowledge systems and the role they have in the fight against climate change. Now, we are not seeing agritourism here in Vanuatu as a niche form of tourism, but a behavioral change and resilience strategy through the development of regenerative agritourism experiences. And a key point that I'd like to make also is that with Vanuatu developing experiences, these agritourism experiences, regenerative agritourism experiences, it's not just for international visitors experiences, but they are more so for re-educating, to be used for re-educating of our people. So going forward, what Regenerative Vanua is doing for Vanuatu is working with the Vanuatu Bureau standards in developing our own indigenous regenerative standards. And that is mainly so to ensure we don't have greenwashing of the term itself. So you could see in the PowerPoint slide, there are a few stakeholders that we are working with, particularly the Indigenous Tourism BC. We're working closely with them and our other colleagues from other island countries and destinations abroad. And if any questions or any interests, queries with regards to what we are doing here in Vanuatu in the area of agritourism, regenerative agritourism, we have our email address listed on the slide below. And we look forward to more discussion around this area and see how we can all collaborate together moving forward. Other than that, we'd like to thank you again for giving us this opportunity to give you an update on what we're doing here as our efforts in this journey. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jerry. Thanks so much for those insights. So, I mean, there are quite a few things that really jumped out at me, and I'm sure some other members of the panel. The idea of, first of all, mentioning Vanua meaning community and land and home, I think points to what really is the collective responsibility of the stewardship of food security, we have to see this as something that affects all of us, not just a few of us. And, once we collectively can look at moving forward, I think we'll find a lot of solutions there. We can also see that crucial distinction made critically between food security and nutrition security. Very much the choice is up to us, and very much if we make the wrong choices, it will undermine the long-term nutritional benefits of us as island nations. So we have to be aware that sometimes we make choices because they seem to be the wiser ones, or they're more something that seems more appealing and convenient, but really and truly the long-term effects of that is to undermine the integrity of our own indigenous food systems and our own food security. So imported food actually, is a key determinant. The amount of food we import actually undermines, the need for us to be self-sufficient and the need for us to be more self-reliant when it comes to building our agricultural sector. And that knowledge in our own indigenous food systems and our local food systems. It's interesting. We talk about innovative approaches to agriculture and food security, but these approaches have been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's more a matter of us kind of rediscovering them and bringing them to the forefront a bit better. We also appreciate Jerry's mention of agritourism, and linking that to food security really shows us how this multi-stakeholder approach is a good way to build a foundation to move forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Ben Tustin. Ben, who is the founder of the Seaweed Food Company. Ben, the floor is yours. Welcome and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Stacey. Do please jump in when I've done my time, because I can literally talk all day about this. As you may realise, I'm going to talk about seaweed. And the reason we established the Seaweed Food Company about 3 years ago. Previous to then, we were producing seaweed as fertiliser. First of all, I want to talk about seaweed itself and its uses. So particularly as a food. So as a foodstuff, obviously it's used in Southeastern Asian culture predominantly at the moment. However, it has actually been used around the world for millennia, and certainly since Neolithic times. One of the issues is, and it was interesting what the previous speaker mentioned about Vanuatu, about the lack of pride in local food culture, is one of the reasons that we don't know about seaweed as a food is that traditionally it has been eaten by the poor, because the poor were living by the coast and that was all that was available. Interestingly, seaweed is incredibly nutritious. It is probably the most nutritious foodstuff on the planet. And the reason is you can survive on seaweed alone, by the way. You don't need to eat any meat, fish or vegetables, because with a variety of seaweeds available, and best guess is between 20 and 30,000 species of seaweeds worldwide, we can get all of our vitamins, all of our nutrients, all of our trace elements very, very easily from seaweed. And it is predominantly protein, so it's full of energy and has, in fact, relatively few carbohydrates, sufficient carbohydrates in order to process the protein and the vitamins and minerals. But it's incredibly healthy, and it has been recognised, and there has been plenty of research done, particularly, as I mentioned, in Southeast Asia, and more in the Southern Hemisphere, where people eat seaweed as part of their diet, in reducing coronary heart disease, in reducing the likelihood of diabetes, and generally providing all the nutrition that the body needs. There's been various studies about various different types of seaweed compared to so-called superfoods such as blueberries, kale, etc. And generally speaking, almost any seaweed will have far more vitamins and nutrients than the likes of traditional superfoods, kale, blueberries, etc. So that's one aspect. It's incredibly nutritional, and you can survive on it. Would you want to eat seaweed exclusively? No, probably not. You'd probably get a bit bored of it. However, introducing seaweed to the diet is very important, not only nutritionally, but also seaweed, in terms of growing it, does not take up any land, and it does not use fresh water. And that is very fundamental to climate resilience. Our biggest issue with all of the food that we eat, whether it be meats or vegetables, is that it takes up space and it uses an enormous amount of fresh water, particularly meat, of course. Whereas seaweed obviously grows naturally. It's also one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. If not, in fact, certain types of kelp are the fastest growing organism on the planet. Depending where you are, kelp can grow up to 20, in fact, 30 centimeters in a day. Seaweed is not a plant, it is an algae. It's a very different organism than plants. As an overall, across the planet, seaweed absorbs, we believe, more than 55% of the planet's CO2. What I am suggesting, and various people around the world who are obsessed with seaweed like I am, is that we should be encouraging a lot more seaweed farms. Seaweed farming is very easy to establish. Gathering spores from seaweed isn't too difficult. And putting it out to sea, and you typically put it out in ropes, it's becoming more popular. Certainly India at the moment is doing a big push on seaweed farms. And the reason is that coastal populations often are suffering economically. They're not particularly wealthy, and being able to put out ropes that have got spores on and growing seaweed incredibly quickly, you can harvest certain types of seaweed within 6 weeks, certainly within 3 months, and use it and sell it as a food product is very good for the economy. And incredibly nutritious for the population. So we're actually based in Guernsey, which most of you probably wouldn't have heard of. Guernsey is a tiny island off the coast of France, which is actually a crown dependency of Great Britain. Guernsey, we're very lucky because we have a huge tidal range. It's 10-meter tidal range, and we have relatively temperate waters. It's certainly not as cold as Scotland or indeed Iceland. And we have around about 40 miles of coastline, which doesn't sound a lot, but in Guernsey, we have at least 750 different species of seaweed. And seaweed in Guernsey has been incredibly important for millennia. Since Neolithic times, we have been collecting seaweed as fertilizer. And it was such an important industry to this island as fertilizer. Throughout certainly from the 15th century, there are written records of it being so important that it was top of the agenda of any governmental decision whenever the government of Guernsey actually met. The amount of seaweed that was taken from the beaches was quite incredible when you consider a 40-mile coastline. In the mid-19th century, someone actually did record the amount that was taken off, and it was around about 250,000 tons in 1 year, which for 40-mile stretch of coastline is quite phenomenal. Now, this was drift seaweed. So there's obviously seaweed that's drifted up on the tide, is very useful for fertilizer. Generally for foodstuffs, we cut seaweed because we know it's completely fresh. But drift seaweed is very important because it can be used as fertilizer, and it can even be used as fertilizer when it starts rotting. So what that seaweed has done is that it's been floating around in the ocean and it has absorbed an enormous amount of CO2. If it is allowed to rot on the beach, it will release the CO2 back into the atmosphere. If we put it into the soil, it will trap the carbon. Now, and furthermore, the nature of seaweeds, and particularly the variety of seaweeds, is that it provides every single vitamin and nutrient and trace element that soil needs. What was slightly fascinating is that in Guernsey, we never discovered crop rotation in the Middle Ages when everyone else in Britain did, and Europe. And the reason we didn't was because we didn't need to. Because if you put seaweed on the soil, you can grow the same crop every single year because it gives the soil absolutely everything. We're quite, and particularly at the moment, with obviously the energy crisis and the price of gas, fertilizer is certainly in Europe, and I do believe this is the case in America as well, to a certain extent, it's unaffordable because the fertilizer producers, and I mean the chemical fertilizer producers, have shut everything down because they cannot afford the gas that they need to produce the fertilizer. Now, there is an enormous amount of drift seaweed all around the beaches of Europe, certainly. I'll come on to the Caribbean in a second. There's an enormous amount of drift seaweed, and it's rotting, generally speaking. If it's rotting, as I say, it's releasing the CO2. Gathering it up it doesn't even need to be dried, and it certainly doesn't need to be washed, actually. One of the important aspects of seaweed is the biome, which is the slimy bit, which no one likes swimming in, but is very, very good for your soil. It's also very good for your skin, by the way, but that's another story. So it doesn't need to be washed. It can be put straight into the land. It can be ploughed in, or indeed it can be left on the top, and rainwater will naturally take in the nutrients into the soil. So it's a wonderfully natural fertilizer that none of us are using, or very few of us are using, which personally I find quite staggering. But also, if you're using it on the land, it will repair chemical fertilized land within 18 months, whereas I mean, traditional other organic type fertilizers can certainly take 2 or 3 years. So we've got a 10,000 year history here in Guernsey of using seaweed as both fertilizer and food. One thing that we're advocating, well, certainly Seaweed Farms are brilliant, but the other thing that we're advocating is not over processing. So there's some natural things that you can do with seaweed in order to eat it that are perfectly reasonable. So sea spaghetti is a great example. It's called sea spaghetti for a reason, because it looks like spaghetti and it pretty much tastes like spaghetti, although it's got a nice little oniony crunch to it. There's all different types of seaweed that we can eat as food that certainly in Western Europe, or in fact the entirety of Europe, are freely available. In terms of the, sorry, Stacey, are you going to stop me?
No, not at all. Not at all.
In terms of the drift seaweed, certainly in the Caribbean, obviously we all know the biggest problem is sargassum. Sargassum is a nightmare for tourism. I appreciate that. It's extremely wide, and it washes up in huge swathes on the eastern coast of the Caribbean. The reason we believe that sargassum is blooming so heavily in the Atlantic is because of excessive CO2 in the atmosphere. Sargassum is particularly good at absorbing CO2. And the only reason it's called sargassum is because it was originally discovered in the Sargasso Sea. It's believed to be Southeast Asian in origin, although it's difficult to say for sure. The reason it's flourishing is CO2 in the sea. That is why it is flourishing. So it will flourish absolutely everywhere. We're seeing it in Western Europe, sargassum, starting to become a problem. One of the differences with sargassum, and there's a few other types of seaweed that can do this, but it doesn't need to be attached to anything, so it can float around. Hence, we've got this massive bloom floating about in the Atlantic that washes up on the shores, and they're washing up 20, 30 tons a day. And I'm sure people in the Caribbean are looking at this, although it would be nice to look at it in more detail. Sargassum is incredibly useful. It's not got the variety of all types of seaweed, but it is full of nutrients. It's full of vitamins. It can be used as fertilizer. It doesn't need to be processed at all. It can be worked into soil to grow the vegetables that we need, and the vegetables to feed the animals that we need. Furthermore, what it can also be used for is in parts as a partial dietary supplement for cattle, of course, because as I'm sure we all know, if you feed cattle, it depends on the type of seaweed, but between 5 and 10% of their diet is made up of seaweed. It can reduce their methane emissions from anything but from 60 to 90%. And obviously methane is the worst greenhouse gas. So I'd be fascinated to find out which Caribbean islands are actually looking at that, particularly when you're looking at cattle farms in South and Central America. They've got a natural market for a cattle feed additive. So in terms of the drift seaweed, we really need to use it as fertilizer, or indeed potentially animal feed, as long as it can be tested and it can be shown to be suitably edible. And there's not enough research done in this at the moment. But part of the research is often people just trying things. Personally, I just go out on the rock pools and just eat everything, because by the way, there aren't any seaweeds that aren't edible, so you can just experiment. Some of them taste absolutely horrible, but you can have a go. And I do advocate experimenting on yourself. But yeah, with whether it's either for land agriculture, or whether it's actually farming to sink more CO2, to absorb more CO2. Personally, I'm not suggesting seaweed is a single solution to the world food crisis or climate issues at all, but it's a massive, massive part of it. And people don't seem to be aware of it. And if we don't need to process it, and if we're not using fresh water, we're not using land, and it's benefiting, and it's far more nutritious than any other foodstuff. I'm slightly surprised why more people aren't taking advantage of the natural resource that most countries have got literally sitting on their doorstep. Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks very much. And that's a lot of food for thought there. Thinking about seaweed, knowing that, I mean, we tend to, I know in Barbados regarding the sargassum, a lot of it is viewed as mainly being used for fertilizer. That's what it's good for. We are very aware that there, yes, as you mentioned, there needs to be a lot more research and development done in this particular area. So just looking back over some of the points you made, Ben, I think the point you mentioned about the stigmatization of local indigenous foodstuffs is a huge problem. So it shows that very much it's about an attitude adjustment for us to see how we can build our own food security. And again, look at something that we have in our own region, and as you mentioned, on our doorstep, as something that can be a meaningful part of a solution to building food security. I think the idea of seaweed being so nutritionally dense was really very, very interesting. The fact that it has all the nutritional elements, all the trace elements, all the vitamins and minerals, I think is crucial. And the idea of introducing seaweed incrementally into a diet, I think would be more appealing to some people. The same way some people, they don't go completely vegan or vegetarian, but they do. I know some households might have a meatless Monday. I just instantly thought of having a seaweed Saturday and maybe just trying to introduce things very gradually to see how we can boost using seaweed a bit more often. I see your
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, quickly say. I mean, yeah, the interesting. So with our company, we started with seaweed seasonings. So it's literally seaweed just sprinkled on food or sprinkled in food. Because also the great thing is it's a flavour enhancer, because amongst other things, seaweed's full of polysodium glutamates, which really kick the taste buds off. So we started with seasonings, and then what we've seen with our loyal customers is that they've then moved on to whole seaweeds. The other, minor point, but I think one of the problems with seaweed is it's called seaweed, and people don't like the fact that it's called a weed. And when they go swimming, they don't like it stroking their legs because it's a bit slimy. If they realise that actually that slime is a biome that is helping their skin hugely, and it's very moisturising, but also if you call it sea vegetables or something similar, it's purely, and it was interesting, your speaker from Vanuatu, it's a psychological issue with local foods. It's a psychological issue with seaweed. Call it sea vegetables, and then you'll eat it.
And then use the marketing, change the whole attitude. I like that approach. And then we also really appreciate the information you gave us, Ben, about the importance of not letting seaweed rot and release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, because anything that's a kind of nature-based solution to carbon capture, I think, is really important. So knowing that seaweed can act as that is something that we should really bear in mind. So thanks so much for all of that information. I see lots of comments in the chat. Some of them are making me hungry. Someone's mentioning seaweed tempura tasting really good. So I think that's something we can think about. How can we add more seaweed into our diet? Okay, so thanks very much, Ben. So we'll move on to now Elise Rostand, the Program Manager of Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research and Education and Design. Hi, Elise, welcome. I know you're in Barbados, like me. Good to see you.
Hi, Stacey. Good to see you too. Good morning, everyone.
Cannot wait to hear your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So it really is my honor and pleasure to be speaking today at this summit. Thank you so much for including us. And I'm just going to share some information about what we do at WIRED and Walker's Reserve in Barbados. So WIRED, as Stacey would have said, stands for the Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design. And it really is quite a mouthful, but that speaks to all the focus areas that our nonprofit and charity is focused on. WIRED is the entity that is managing the regeneration project at Walker's Reserve. where we're taking almost 300 acres on the east coast of Barbados and transforming what is still an active sand quarry into a nature reserve. So Walker's Sand Quarry has been in existence for over 50 years. It really has assisted in building the nation of Barbados from an infrastructural perspective. So the aggregate or sand that has been mined out of the quarry has gone into the building of schools, roads, hospitals, everything infrastructural on island. But like with any other resource, sand is coming to an end. It's finite. So our visionary, our founder, Ian McNeil, would have thought about what we would be doing with this space once sand came to an end, which is happening over the next 2 years. So Wired was established over 3 years ago in order to manage the regeneration of this space that is now Walker's Reserve, taking this quite barren, desert-like, environment and building habitats, developing ecosystems, increasing biodiversity into what we see today. And the image that you see behind me is actually one of our drone shots from Walker's Reserve. So again, this is almost a 300-acre space on the east coast of Barbados. We focus on really building a model for climate resiliency in the Caribbean. We're the largest regeneration project and project of its kind in the region. And we focus on biodiversity and environmental conservation. We have youth and education engagement programs, lots of initiatives there. Empowered communities. So we work very closely with the parish of St. Andrew, but all the parishes throughout Barbados. And then we have lots of partnerships throughout the region and internationally as well. And then we're looking at regenerative businesses. So what can we do to generate revenue that is going to take this project forward that can also be replicated in other spaces and scaled across other projects? We do a lot of knowledge sharing through our sister organization, the Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute. And we also have another sister organization, Slow Food Barbados, that we work very closely with. And given, today's theme of food security, food sovereignty, I definitely want to place a highlight on what Slow Food does. They operate out of Walker's Reserve. They use some of the produce that is grown on site through, the work that we're doing regeneratively. And they have been doing a lot of work within the community through their soup drive, where they're providing nourishing meals for several members of the community that are in vulnerable situations. They also do a lot of workshops along with CPRI. CPRI just concluded a permaculture design course, which they do regularly throughout the year. And that again is giving people skills and teaching persons about how you can grow food in your backyard from an organic perspective. And like Stacey would have mentioned earlier, it really is almost about going back to the traditional ways of doing things, but adding innovative approaches to make sure that these, initiatives are successful. One of the other exciting initiatives that we have started at the reserve, because we do tours, so we have a huge ecotourism initiative and programs that we offer. We also do agritourism, and we've started hosting farmers markets, so as we call it, an eco market once a month, where we really are holding space for members of the community, our farmers, our artisans, to come in, and we invite people to come and experience the reserve, not just from an environmental standpoint, but also looking at the food that has been able to grow on site through our hard work, but also the food that is grown in the parish of St. Andrew and throughout the island using organic methodologies. This is something we're really proud of because people can come and really experience the space, connect with our farmers, connect with members of our community, and understand from a very grassroots level how these solutions can be implemented when we're looking at facing the climate, challenges that all of us have to address if we are to survive in the region. So I think I'll stop there for now, Stacey. If there's anything else you wanted me to expound on, you can. Our work, covers a breadth of initiatives. We have a bee program where we do a lot of mentorship with the youth. Again, through our tours, we have a lot of school children that come through the site. Like I mentioned, we work with Slow Food Barbados, and they have done work in schools in the community where they've created school gardens, and that has been a fantastically successful program. And then we also do a lot of data collection. So we work with academic institutions. We provide opportunities for people to come to site and do field studies. So our work runs the gamut of fun to education, to academics, to green business, to, plant propagation, skill development, training. There's lots of opportunities to engage with us. And, it's been really, really fantastic to see all the fantastic discussions that have been held over the week. And even in this panel, there's been so many nuggets of wisdom that have come up that have resonated with what we do at Walker's Reserve, primarily when it comes to food sovereignty and looking at, our identification as Caribbean people and the import that we put on local food and local products.
Yeah, oh my goodness, Elise. So I will say that the amount, there's really positive comments in the chat. And I will first begin with a disclaimer saying I'm a bit biased, but I can honestly say that what's happening
we know
is as fantastic as it sounds. Having been there, it runs the gamut, as Elise mentions, from regenerative projects, conservation, education, building local agriculture resilience, and then building that to entrepreneurial resilience. Because as Elise mentioned, at the local eco market, it's members of the community who can come and have a way to show what they're doing. If it's almost the equivalent of a cottage industry, but people who are looking to be more self-sufficient and kind of get their entrepreneurship spirit out there, it's a fantastic place for that. In terms of also just bringing members of the community together and being in touch with what agriculture can mean to you, which really rang true in the kind of the wake of COVID-19, when so many people were looking to, have their backgrounds. I will confess, I managed to grow some okra. That was the only thing in the room.
It's not as easy as it looks, but
no,
yes,
it's not. And I'm sorry, I did not go to Walker's before then and get some tips that are so easy to implement.
Exactly.
The idea of scale. It can be 1, 2 people, it can be a whole community. So I will, really encourage people to, check out the website that's for Walker's Reserve and all of the, activities that can be done from an educational standpoint as well, focusing on the youth as the future climate activists or those with the knowledge who can bring us back from the climate brink. That's something else that is really important that you mentioned, Elise. So we should all kind of look at this as a way to, an example, along with Ben's ideas of seafood and seaweed. I said seafood, seaweed. We should call it more seafood. That's a good point.
Yes, yes.
And we're saying, how do we name it? The nomenclature is so important. So thanks so much, Elise. I know we have some questions in the chat, which I'll get to after we have our next panelist. So thanks very much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So Miguel, we'll move on to you. We'd like to hear all about what you bring to the table, Miguel, no pun intended. Thanks so much for taking the time today, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you guys, and thank you for the invitation. I really love all what I already hear regarding what you say, Ben and Elise. Just a few words about MyDTech. So MyDTech, it's an agri-tech company. Our goal is really simple, is to simplify the day-to-day of the farmer, to help them to optimize, secure, and track their production. And for that, we collect all the data we can on the farm. And our approach is completely local. So based on that, I think based on the topic of this summit, data is one of the key points to be resilient. It's because you know where you are exactly today and what can happen tomorrow, you can improve your actual resilience. So it's why, based on that, at MyDTech, we have like more than 10 products to help the farmer to collect the data, to understand and to make better decisions. So we have a weather station, we have connected voltmeters, and like you say, Ben, the soil, it's everything. So we have soil sensor to explain to the farmer on this kind of soil, on your farm, you can have this kind of plants. We have also activity collar. This is really cool. We have a patent on this one. It's like a watch connected, but we have this for the animals, so we can know where is the animals, which kind of disease he can have, if he's ready to have babies. And another point, I don't know who says that about water. I think on the other point regarding resilience, it's water. So data number one is like it's one of the key points. Water is like a massive stuff, and we have to be really humble regarding this. And only even for this one, we have valve irrigation where we can with your MyDetect application decided to open or stop your valve, and you can change or increase the number of water. So this one is really appreciated by our farmers. And we are based in a Caribbean, in a French Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, not Barbade for now. I hope one day. In France and in Africa too. I'm calling you guys from Lomé. We have a deployment about 160 weather station and soon soil sensor. So data is king. Act locally is king, because when we will have, I don't know when, but if we are talking about this, is like, because for sure the climate change and we'll have some disaster. It is what it is. And so all the food structure will change and have to change now. So it's why you have to act, and we have to act locally. And it's why all our data is data we put we gather locally from the farm of the farmer. Water is a massive king. And another point, I think we all will be agree with this one, and I think Elise, no, Stacy, we talk about the indigenous. We have already all the knowledge. You say innovation, but the innovation is already on the path, and the innovation is already in the nature, and the best teacher is the indigenous. In my personal experience, I manage community in Costa Rica, in the Caribbean side, in Puerto Rico, working with the indigenous and work with to make school for the kids. And all the knowledge is already there. So it's all, and this also it's data to share and to spread, like you say, Elise, with the training we propose also when we install the sensor and all the equipment for the farmer, some training to explain them how to go slowly throughout the organic, because it's really important. And the last point I want to share with you, it's one of the pillars of this topic about resiliency and for sure how to maintain the life. I was like during the COVID period in Costa Rica, and everything was completely shut down. And the market, the supermarket, and the local farmer, it was impossible for them to go on the street to sell their products. So at this moment, like money was really not important. So at this moment, it was a key for me is like, finally, the human relationship was the new currency. It's like, because I know you, because we create bonds together, it was possible to trade something. And so at this moment, all the little village I was organized themselves thanks to WhatsApp group. And we exchange like this food and tips and stuff to live in community. So data is king, act locally, king, water, and the last one, it's community to be resilient.
Thanks very much, Miguel. That was awesome. I think the standout takeaway from that is when you said human relationships become the new currency. I think that was a really insightful comment, and very, very true, in light of what we had experienced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It made us see the importance of really building food systems, but, even more than that, from a local level, building locally and making those local connections. And then at the heart of all that is something that a lot of people find boring, but it's so fundamental to everything, is data. So I think that if, more research and more focus on data collection at every levels of a community can form a really important foundation to how we can springboard into, as you say, building resilience, and then having that creep into the educational aspect of many people. And we think of education as only formal education, but there's the knowledge between communities, that knowledge sharing that happens between generations, and we can link back to indigenous knowledge as well, that I think is really, really crucial. So, and then, you mentioned we'd love to, if you could put in the chat, if you have a website or if you have where we can get more information on MyDetect, because there's an important role of, people forget the role of technology in agriculture, I think is
Yeah.
something that more and more we have to focus on. I know well, in some ways we think of technology as being on one side and agriculture being on the other, but I think we've got to form a nexus between the two of those, because it's
Yeah.
forming that connection is what's going to build the resilience. And agricultural technology is much more accessible than a lot of people think. So, you know, seeing it used in communities and seeing how we can benefit it from all levels, it's going to be absolutely crucial. So we really appreciate your presentation. That was really informative and very complimentary. Thank you. Thanks, Miguel. So I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn back their cameras on. Everyone can put your cameras on. We're going to go into a question and answer segment. And I do see some questions coming up in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with a question to Ben. We have a question from Marlon Madden, who has said that how can sargassum be used as fertilizer when some officials have indicated that it has quite high levels of some elements which are harmful for consumption? So I think there, Marlon might be making reference to certain heavy metals. So I think that does point to what you observed about there needing to be more research, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's very valid, actually. I think someone else asked a question about mercury in the water as well, and whether it can absorb it. Certainly, some types of seaweed can absorb heavy metals, and that can be an issue. Unfortunately, we do pollute our waters with heavy metals, but what I would suggest, it's not so much testing seaweed if you're using it as fertilizer. You need to then test if it goes through to the soil but subsequently into the plants themselves. I mean, seaweed will largely clean the sea. That is what it is trying to do. It is trying to clean the atmosphere in the sea. So it tends to process heavy metals and turns the heavy metals into something that is less toxic. However, it is possible, certainly lithium, mercury, and there is other heavy metals can be absorbed and then will subsequently go into the soil. My question is whether it will actually go into the plants that you're looking to grow. I mean, I must admit, there's also, to a certain extent here, what is the worst scenario? You're currently probably eating vegetables that were grown using glyphosate, which is horrific, and it does get into vegetables. And we've all probably eaten some vegetables in the last month that were actually grown as a result of using glyphosate as a herbicide. So I'm not saying heavy metals are great, obviously. However, I would be testing the end plant, not the seaweed, if you're using it as fertilizer, because the process itself of putting it on the soil, interacting with the soil, the important thing, and this is what people don't particularly understand about fertilizers. Seaweed, for example, doesn't have a massive amount of nitrogen in it. However, it encourages the microbes in the soil to produce nitrogen. It's the process. It's not the elements or the chemical or the molecules themselves that pass directly from seaweed to soil to plant. It is the process. And it's what we're trying to do is encourage microbial activity in the soil. If we've got soil that is very active with good microbes, they will process pretty much everything. Admittedly, heavy metals are more difficult, and I'm sure Miguel knows more about that than me. But ultimately, it is what is ending up in the plants. I would suggest test the plants, not the seaweed.
Yeah, and I think what this demonstrates is the need for there to be much more research and development in this particular area. And you have also suggested, Ben, that there's some seaweeds that are better suited to consumption and some that are better suited to fertilizer. I think that's something that we have to bear in mind, but really pinning down which is which locally in some regions, I think that's really crucial. Okay, awesome. Okay, I'm gonna check the chat again. I have a question here, which I think anyone can answer, but I think Elise might have some of the expertise here regarding food entrepreneurs, like local food entrepreneurs. One of the issues that many food entrepreneurs face is that in order to make some kind of profit, because of the increasing costs of fuels and other things, the prices get higher and higher. Are there any ideas from your end, Elise, regarding how can food entrepreneurs make a profit without it being that they are making their prices so high that they alienate potential customers, particularly people who are local? I think that's
Yeah,
a
so I think there's several parts to that question and answering that question, because we have to look at what's happening from a policy level as well as what would be happening from the individual entrepreneur level. So for us, we work with the OCGA, which is the Organic Growers and Consumers Association, and they have really come together. You know, like Miguel said, collaboration is the new currency. So it's not one voice, it's not one entrepreneur, one farmer trying to go out there and make a difference. They have really come together to produce, you know, peer-reviewed standards locally, to try to get things into supermarkets and different chains as a collective. And that has really worked for them, where you're moving a certain amount of volume, which then starts to make sense for your unit costs. Again, through Slow Food Barbados, you know, we've had several discussions with some retail chains, supermarket chains, because they do support the soup drive where they're donating things, about the reverse happening, where product from the farmers that we work with can go into, you know, the supermarkets and get on the shelves, or value-added products. So I think there are several elements to looking at, you know, the supply chain and who's responsible for what. But I think there has to be that collective voice that comes to government or goes to, you know, people who are making policy decisions and saying, these are some of the issues that our farmers are facing, our entrepreneurs are facing. We need to provide an enabling environment for them to succeed. And then on the other side, a lot of the NGOs, we need to be doing some public awareness, where we're motivating people to eat local, where we're providing, you know, encouragement, and we are creating that, you know, need, that demand for the local product, that then starts to outweigh what is being brought in. Because it really all comes down to scale, it comes down to volume. And being, you know, small islands, we also have to look at trading amongst, you know, the region with each other versus bringing things from, you know, international shores. So lots of different elements there. So the takeaway I would say is that, you know, people really need to work together on all levels, but there has to be discussion between what's happening on a policy level, what's happening, you know, nationally, and then how that redounds to the benefit of the individual farmer.
Yes, thank you. And we're getting a lot of appreciation for that answer, Elise, in the chat. Thanks. As you say, you know, collaboration and the idea of farmers coming together, which I think actually segues nicely into a question in the chat to go to Miguel. Miguel, we have a question regarding if you have any digital systems to track when plants need water. And I think how can farmers probably use what you have to offer to create that sense of collaboration?
Wow, this is an amazing stuff. It's one of the products we want to launch soon, mainly in Africa, because it's like everyone knows, it's like the water is like really a key element for the food. So it's something that's ongoing, but we will do this to combine the fact which kind of water, because we already have the weather station, we already have the soil sensor, so we can combine both and to know and to predict which kind of water do you need, and automatically activate your valve irrigation. So this is possible. So now it's more like based on these soils, we already know you will have this kind of culture. We already know this kind of plants needs this kind of amount of pH, amount of water. So the best for the valve is this. This is ongoing. It's like we need to collect more data to predict this kind of stuff. So to answer the question, it's ongoing.
That's fantastic. I think that actually links to what Elise had mentioned about.
I was just going to say,
yeah. Please expound if you'd like to.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, Miguel, that, you know, we need to talk, because Barbados is obviously a water scarce island, you know, primarily limestone. But where we are in the Scotland district on the East Coast, you know, our geology is different, where we have the benefit of, you know, the clay soils being able to retain water. And we actually have some freshwater lakes on site that allow us to pump water into where we have grown, you know, irrigate the vegetation that we've planted. But we are doing a water study as we speak, where we're looking at, you know, all these different factors when it comes to freshwater conservation, rainwater conservation on site, to future-proof the project, and looking at how we can include innovative approaches to testing water and also managing and monitoring water on site, as well as the other projects that we partner on. So I would be very, very interested in learning
Perfect.
more about what you are doing and seeing how that could potentially be integrated into our work.
Boom, perfect. Let's do it.
Great. Okay, we'll make those connections. I'll email both of you. Thanks so much for that.
Thank
I
you.
love the serendipity of when it all comes together and we see how it goes together. It's perfect. Okay, Ben, there was actually another question for you, Ben, in the chat. This was asking about if increased seaweed farming would have an impact on the wider ecological balance. So, and how dependent is seaweed farming on temperature? And then a question that I had linked to that was the idea of the infrastructure around seaweed farming. Is that something that might be a challenge for developing coastal communities? Can you give us some insight on that?
Sure, and I'll answer the questions in reverse if you don't mind. In terms of developing coastal communities, it's phenomenally easy to farm seaweed, providing that you can obtain the spores, which it's not hard to teach someone how to farm seaweed. And in fact, there's some great projects, particularly in Canada, in British Columbia, actually. There's some brilliant work going on there. They're setting up seaweed farmers on almost on a weekly basis, actually. And it is easy. You can create, you can harvest your own spores. You can put it out on roads. The infrastructure is not difficult at all. Certainly anywhere southern hemisphere, particularly and equatorial, it's incredibly easy because there's not a massive tidal range. So you're looking at literally ropes and posts, and we're not talking about a massive investment at all. In terms of, sorry, what was your? I've answered your last question. What was the first point?
That was to do with seaweed farming having a wider ecological impact, and if it was dependent.
That's a really good point. We don't know. What we don't want to do is start introducing seaweeds to environments that haven't seen them before. So at the sea temperature, will make a difference to a certain extent. Seaweed's pretty robust. So, I mean, in the northern hemisphere, our seaweed, our sea temperature here will go from, can easily go from 5 to 15 degrees Celsius within a season. So it's pretty robust, and it's the same in the southern hemisphere. But increased temperature will upset certain types of seaweed in certain hemispheres for sure. In which case, there is an argument to say, okay, well, shift the farming, to a slightly cooler area or slightly warmer area, depending on what's required. Ecological impact is a big issue, and we don't really know. We honestly don't know because it's a massive issue. I mean, it's much like trying to follow carbon through the carbon chain. It's almost impossible to ascertain the ecological impact of farming seaweed. One thing that I'm particularly interested in, I've seen done in Norway, and certainly Scandinavians seem to be leading it, is vertical ocean aquaculture, which I'm absolutely fascinated in, and I think is, if I'm honest, a stroke of genius, where they've got green seaweeds growing at the top of a rope, which is vertically, obviously down into the sea. You then got mussels growing on the rope. You then got brown seaweeds a little bit further down. You then got oysters growing below that. You've then got red seaweeds at the bottom. Then you've got things like abalone and clams growing below that. That's absolutely fascinating because you're creating your own ecosystem. And they all feed off each other. They feed off the various bits and pieces that come off the seaweed. The seaweed can be used, all of the shellfish can be used, etc. So vertical ocean aquaculture, I think, it would be a far better way, if possible, of farming seaweed than straightforward seaweed farms. But sorry, can I just answer? I'm just going to go back to the last question, actually, because I was just chatting to someone the other day. We're talking about water issues in places like Barbados and others. Mm-hmm. I was actually chatting to one of the professors at Manchester University who helped discover graphene. They're producing water filters that can can desalinate benignly without energy, which I think things like filtration systems with fresh water could be really interesting for land agriculture in the future, in the very near future, in fact.
Yeah. Wow, we're seeing so much coming out of the session. It's like, I feel as if it should just begin now again, but unfortunately we have to draw things to a close. But this was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for your time, for your knowledge, for your insights. You know, we'll keep the connections going. We'll be posting on, you know, our Island Innovation platforms more about you and your initiatives, and, you know, also the idea of us connecting, and, you know, because what's really important is what happens after this, right? This is the beginning of what we hope to be really great future collaboration. Thanks so much to the speakers. We'd like to remind everyone in an hour coming up, we have another session about invasive species in the Caribbean. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. We have 2 more days of the Virtual Island Summit.
Thank
So
you.
Thank you guys, it was really nice.
Yes.
Okay, bye
Perfect.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.